So today I'm speaking to Anna C. Wilson, all about her new book, A Place for Everything. This is about Anna's mother's late diagnosis of autism at 72 years of age, I believe, and the years of mental health difficulties that led to the autism diagnosis. So Anna, thank you for your time today. And have I described your book accurately?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, it's a memoir about my mum. And yeah, she wasn't diagnosed till she was 72. So that's what sort of gave me the idea for writing the book, really, because I felt that was quite unusual. I started a blog, about 4 years ago when my father died. My father died before my mother. And it was after his death that we discovered that mum had autism. And I wrote the blog just for me because I was grieving and I needed an outlet. And I've always dealt with life by writing. That's been my way of sort of coping with things. And I didn't really expect anyone to read it. I put it on my own personal Facebook page thinking a few friends might read it and that would be that. And then I started getting really good feedback from people who said that I had written about things in a way that they could empathise with and understand. And then slowly but surely, people came forward telling me that they had autism and they wanted to talk to me about it. So there was one friend in particular who had self-diagnosed. She was about 40 and her marriage was failing. And she knew it was her. Well, she says she knew it was her. She knew there was something in her that was making things, not right. And she started to read up about autism and took herself off for a formal diagnosis. So I met up with this friend who'd said, she'd been reading my blog. And she, along with a few other people, said, you really must turn this into a book. There's something more here than just a few blog posts. And for ages, I just thought, I don't know how to do this. I've written lots of books, but they've all been stories for children. I didn't know how I was going to make a narrative out of a real life situation. So I read a lot of other memoirs, really, to give me an idea of how to do it. And I just started knitting my blog together to see if it would form some kind of narrative.
Being someone of a mature age who wasn't diagnosed till 48, 10 years ago now. And my story is not dissimilar to your mother's in that, so many people of our generation, your mother is a bit older than me, but autism wasn't a diagnosis when we were kids. People didn't quite know what the problem was. They used various slightly derogatory words to describe people like us. And, I'm not sure if this would have been your mother's story as well growing up. The other thing I wanted to say, the title, I think I can guess a little bit about why you called it this, but A Place for Everything.
Yes, well, it came out of the fact that when I was writing the memoir, I kept finding myself going back to this phrase that Mum had, a place for everything and everything in its place, because she was very strict about us keeping things tidy. And she hated it if she couldn't find something. It would, she would get very upset, actually, if she couldn't find her keys or whatever it was. And she would chant this was her mantra, a place for everything, everything in its place. And I realised when I read through the first draft that I must have written that phrase into the book so many times. It was like a sort of, it was too much, I had to edit a lot of them out, obviously. So I was chatting to my editor about this when I finally got a publisher. And she said, what are you going to call the book? And I said, at the moment it's called Missing the Boat, because Mum missed the boat on the diagnosis. And she said, it doesn't really say what it should and everything else. And then she said, I'm sure there'll be a phrase that will just jump out. And I just went, a place for everything. And it was, we laughed really, but yeah.
Am I right in thinking your mother was also diagnosed with OCD?
She didn't have a formal diagnosis for that, no, but there were certainly elements of that in her behaviour, yes. So it was a funny mixture, though, because she would be very fussy about some things and then other things she didn't seem to be able to cope with, and they would become quite messy. So she wasn't very good at coping with finance or sort of anything to do with sort of running of the household like that. That was all Dad's work, if you like. And when Dad died, that was all in total disarray because Mum couldn't cope with any of that. And I think my understanding of that now is that there were some things she just panicked about because they were too difficult for her to get her head around, which is fair enough. But everything to do with housework and child rearing and all of that was very yeah, she was fairly OCD. Yeah.
Do you feel that there were lots of opportunities over the years where your mother's autism could have been picked up along the way?
I think in an ideal world, yes, because looking back, all the signs were very clear. But of course, as you say, the opportunities weren't there for a diagnosis when she was younger. I think what frustrates me is that as she got older, so into her 40s and 50s, she had a lot of things like severe gastric pain and a lot of anxiety about her health. And she would go to a doctor presenting with these things. Often they would do some kind of investigation and find there wasn't anything physically wrong. And then in her notes, which I subsequently got, there would be something along the lines of, this woman seems to be particularly anxious, or, I recommend this woman be given a trial of Prozac for a while, or something like that. And nothing was ever followed through. And to me, those are red lights, And of course, we know that a lot of gastric pain is related to anxiety. So I think for me, there's a frustration that there was no joined up thinking between physical medical problems, if you like, and possible mental ones, neurological ones, whatever. But because autism was so misunderstood for so long, particularly amongst women, I think, I have to be a little forgiving, because I don't think that the facilities were there to help her.
They still aren't. The mental health services and those that know about autism are really not the same thing. And the two areas do not talk to each other very often. There are attempts these days to join these things up a bit. And it's an area that I'm particularly passionate about. Do you know much about your mother's history growing up? I mean, did she have a fairly straightforward childhood, or were there any sort of signs that you would think now, looking back?
Yes, well, I've talked to my uncle a lot about this, because he's her younger brother, and he has some very strong memories. And he helped me when I was writing the book, because I had to sort of ask, was there anything unusual about Mum, if you like, when she was younger? And I think for so many years he had kept buttoned up about it all, because I think when people thought there was potentially mental health problem, you didn't talk about that. So it was all sort of brushed under the carpet. But the more I got him talking, the more he would bring up stories of her behaviour. And I think, yes, my grandmother did find her very challenging at times. And there was some very stark things that happened. There was one time when Mum threw herself into the sea because she'd had enough of everybody, and just ran off and just threw herself into the sea. And that became a sort of a family joke. Oh, do you remember the time when Gillian did that? So I probed a bit deeper with that with my uncle, and he said, actually, it was a horrific day, because she basically had a meltdown, what we would now call a meltdown, and just couldn't stand being with him and his mum anymore, and just ran off and did exactly that. And she could have drowned. And he was only about 8. I think she was 12. And he pulled her out, and he said, I just tried to bury that memory because it was just too awful. And there were other times where she had suicidal thoughts, and she would say, I don't think I can carry on. And she would have, big meltdowns. So, those are red flags now. But I think at the time, as you say, those pejorative terms are used. So she was known as a difficult child, moody, and as she got older, tricky, maybe hysterical, neurotic, all those awful words that are attributed to particularly, I think, female behaviour. And so, it was all sort of brushed under the carpet.
Your mother's is a familiar story on lots of different levels. I know a number of women diagnosed later in life, and they've all come to a diagnosis having had, some fairly extreme difficulties with depression and anxiety. And it just takes one person to say, actually, I think this person's on the spectrum. And I haven't entirely got my head around the differences between male and the way males and females present this condition. But I think there is something to do with the way females socialise. Perhaps women are able to find a way to socialise a bit more effectively as teenagers especially. And it makes it a little harder to pick out some of the symptoms.
Yes. Right. What I'm particularly interested in is Mum always used to say she didn't understand women, and she didn't understand why people had girlfriends. She'd say to me, why do you want... She used to say, I can't think of anything worse than going on holiday with a bunch of women. And I used to think, well, for me, that's lovely. I don't understand why she's so averse to that. And then I mentioned this to my friend who I mentioned earlier, who self-diagnosed. She said, oh, gosh, yes. She said, men are so much more straightforward. If you're socialising with a bunch of men, they say what they think, and it's all out on the table. There's none of this strange sort of social behaviour where you're saying one thing but you think another. There's none of this dissimulation that women seem to have in a group. And she said also women waste a lot of time talking about rubbish that isn't interesting. So they'll bond in a way that's different from men. And I thought, my goodness, that's what Mum didn't like. She couldn't bear empty chit-chat. She wanted to get straight to the point. She wanted to have a political discussion or, and usually turn into an argument. But for her, it was great. It was an intellectual battle. And men were much more up for that, she found, than women.
Yeah.
So I think, yes, and she definitely did the masking thing. I remember she found the school gates, when the women are all standing around waiting for the children to come out after school. She found that really challenging because they would all stand around essentially gossiping. And she had no idea what was going on. And she wasn't much liked because she didn't really enter into it in the way that she should have done. But I know she spent a lot of time watching them all thinking, what am I supposed to be doing here? Trying to work it out. So that rings very true.
Did she have a group of friends, or was she pretty much a loner apart from you and your sister and your dad?
She was quite scathing about people who she didn't think were her intellectual equals. So she was quite good at sort of deciding who was going to be useful or interesting or not. So she had one school friend who she'd known since she was 3. And it's interesting talking to her. She's still alive. And she says, yeah, Mum was quite a prickly friend, but they just had, because they'd known each other since they were tiny, they had a connection, I suppose, that was a lot more forgiving than when you meet people later in life. But other than her, she didn't have really any school friends. And then at university, I suppose people were her intellectual equals, so she had more friends at university. But by then she'd met Dad, who was always by her side. So she had that support, I suppose, in social situations. She would very rarely be on her own. She'd have Dad there too. So yeah, I mean, that all rings true as well.
What was the actual triggers that led up to her getting the diagnosis in the end?
I think the short story is that she was already suffering so badly with mental illness that she was actually sectioned. And it was as a result of that section and coming out of section that she was lucky enough to be seen by a psychologist who recognised her for who she was. But the long story is that my grandmother had been her sort of number one, right-hand woman all her life and had lived down the road from us. And when she died, I could already see the cracks were starting to appear in Mum, if you like. And I actually took her aside and said, before my grandmother was dying, and I took my mum aside and I said, I think you need some help because you're suffering a lot with the loss of your mum, and when she dies, I think it's going to be really, really difficult for you. And Mum just sort of brushed it aside, but sure enough, after that, her mental health became really quite difficult for her to deal with. And then my aunt died very suddenly, and there was another spike of depression after that. And then I think that was the beginning of the unravelling, really. Yeah. So by the time my dad was then diagnosed with cancer, it was just impossible. There was no sort of turning back, really. So there was a sort of a gradual decline over a period of about 8 years when Mum's mental health got worse and worse.
Do you feel that her issues were addressed with effectively? I mean, by the mental health services. I mean, did you sense that they were doing all they could and there was just nothing more they could do? Or?
Yeah, I find this such a difficult question to answer because at the time I was so angry with them because I didn't think they were doing anything. I look back now and I think it was so tricky because she wasn't a very compliant person. So bearing in mind all the sort of boundaries, if you like, of the Mental Capacity Act and what you are able to do as a clinician, I think they probably were doing everything they could do. But well, with the caveat that they weren't thinking about autism at all, which is the real shame, because if that had been in the picture, I think probably there would have been more available to Mum. But no, I was constantly frustrated because the answer always seemed to be drugs, more drugs. And I feel that was not right for Mum. I think she should have had more support much earlier on to learn how to cope with anxiety and depression. But the question is, when should that have started? Probably not when she was already quite ill.
Yeah.
I think there are some ugly truths around the combination of autism and mental health that are still not being addressed these days. And we could get political, but we won't about this. But no, I think anxiety is one of the key aspects of this that I've been going on about on my website for ages now, because we can't cure autism, but we can do something about the anxiety that stems from it. And I'm finding that people that are more independent on spectrum probably suffer more from anxiety because more is expected of them. They don't live in supported living, and they're expected to take part in the world, but with all of these difficulties that other neurotypicals may not necessarily face.
I think she was very lucky in some ways in the time in which she was born, because even university living was quite, it was like an extension of boarding school, really, much more so than it is now. So although they didn't have great mental health provision and pastoral care and all the rest of it, she lived in an all-female college where the rules were very strict and you were expected to be in by a certain time and the gates were locked and you couldn't go out and things like that. And it was quite regimented and there was a very strict timetable. And she loved it. I mean, even much later in life, I would say to her, tell me about your favourite, your happiest times. And she would say, when I was at Cambridge, because everything was so ordered and organised. And she was learning Latin, which was very structured language. And she met Dad very young, and it was perfectly acceptable to get engaged and get married very young. And so nobody thought anything of it, the fact that they were joined at the hip very early on. So I think in many ways she had a lot of structure and support that wasn't organised, but that was kind of naturally there in a way that perhaps now young people with autism perhaps don't have. They leave home, they go to university, they're thrown out into a world where they have to survive on their own. So I don't know, it's just popped into my head, but I think that might be quite an interesting way of looking at things.
Do you mind me asking what job your mother did?
Well, interestingly, she taught Latin at her old school. So when the psychologist was asking me more questions about Mum, because Mum couldn't sit in on the whole diagnosis, she was too upset. When I told him that, he said, "Oh my goodness, being a teacher, that doesn't fit. That doesn't fit." And then when I said, "Oh, it was her old school, and the teachers who taught her were actually still there, and the timetable really hadn't changed that much," he went, "Oh, okay, Latin. She knew where she was. She knew the other staff. Okay, maybe it does fit." And also she always used to say, "Oh, I haven't got much of an imagination," which I sort of now know this whole idea of theory of mind that people talk about with autism. And she used to sort of say wistfully, "Well, why did I just do teaching? I could have done anything, but I didn't know what I wanted to do." So I think it was just a logical thing for her, study Latin, go to university, come back, teach Latin. That just fit the pattern.
I actually think that sometimes people get the wrong idea when they say people on the spectrum don't have an imagination, because some have incredible imaginations, and in fact probably some of the best inventions have been created by people that are on the spectrum. I think sometimes that the imagination thing, I think sometimes it's more to do with social imagination.
Not quite understand what another person may be on about.
Yeah, or not being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, maybe.
Absolutely.
It can make us look very aloof at times, and slightly standoffish, and I think people can get the wrong idea, and it can make us, a little unpopular at times. You can come across as being a bit cold, but really inside the cogs are going, the cogs are whirring, and we're trying to actually work out what this conversation is about. And I think, the easier option is just to not socialise, or have a very small amount of people, that you feel understand you. So this must have put quite a lot of pressure on the family.
Over the years.
Yeah.
How did you cope with that?
Well, I think when my sister and I were small, she was just Mum. So, there was no questioning any of it. And if she had a meltdown about something, or if she was particularly gloomy, we didn't know what the word depression meant. She would say things like, "I feel a bit under the weather," and she'd just sort of retreat. we always had my grandmother to go to. So if things were tough at home, Mum would ring up Grandma and we'd go there. And for us, that was just lovely. So it was just normal life. It was just, Mum's a bit down, go to Grandma's, great. But then as we got older, it did become harder because Mum found the unpredictability of two teenage girls' behaviour was quite stressful for her. I mean, it's stressful for any mum, as I now know, but it was very stressful for her. And that's unfortunately when we started to fall out quite a bit. But again, even then we thought, well, everyone falls out with their parents, and we were growing up in the early 80s when everyone's parents were still quite strict. So if she was strict, we thought, well, that's the way it is. I think it wasn't until we left home that we realised some things were a little bit odd. So the fact that she expected us to call her all the time to let her know where we were all the time, that was just normal for us. And people would start to say, do you really have to phone your mum now? You're 20. Do you have to phone your mum? And people like, yeah, no, we have to phone. And it was things like that that we started to question, I suppose. So it just got harder as we got older. And then for her, she was absolutely devastated that we'd moved away. I think she thought we were going to come back and live next door because that's pretty much what she had done with her mum. It hadn't ever occurred to either of us that that's what we would do. We thought, well, the world's there for the taking. We both travelled, we both got jobs in London, and she found that so hard. And of course, now looking back, I wish I'd had more empathy and understanding because I obviously got quite cross about all of that. And I wish I hadn't.
I guess, she would have struggled with the change of those things happening. And I've always thought of autism as being, on one level, extremes of neurotypical condition. All of our human aspects are sort of magnified through the lens of autism. It's natural for us to feel insecure and worry about our daughters, but we tend to be a bit over the top about this, and perhaps that's what your mother was experiencing.
I think that's absolutely right. I think you've nailed it. And as I've got older, I've recognised these things in myself. And sometimes I have to really button up and not say the things, because it would be so easy to just vent it all. And I think, Mum, well, it's the classic phrase, isn't it? She didn't have any filters, but she would literally just say what was on her mind. So if she was terrified, we all have ridiculous thoughts. If my son's gone off up to London on his own, I might get a tiny thought of, I hope he doesn't get run over, or I hope he doesn't get mugged. But I would never say, don't go up to London because you're going to get mugged. Whereas Mum would say, so now I realise that she was basically just voicing all of her anxieties that they would have as someone without autism. I would still have those anxieties, but I wouldn't voice them. So I think you're absolutely right. That's exactly what it was. But I wish I'd understood at the time.
Yeah, I think, with hindsight, I guess we can all be a genius. But I wish I knew what I knew about myself now, and I could go back and start it all again. In fact, that's what my next book is going to be called. Can I Start Again, Please? I've copyrighted that name, by the way. Because that is kind of, you get to a point in your life and you think, why have all these years been so difficult? And you think, damn, if only I'd known.
Perhaps some of us could forgive ourselves for feeling so down on ourselves.
Yeah.
And it's not surprising that suicidal thoughts, depression, anxiety are way higher amongst the autism community than in the general population.
There's just so much more for us to get anxious about, things that perhaps neurotypical people may say, well, whatever. We can't say that. It becomes this volcanic set of emotions that we don't know how to deal with. And I expect you would have seen that in your mother.
Yes, and I think, as I got older, she would, telephone conversations would go on for so long because she couldn't bear to say goodbye. And they would get more and more emotional as the call went on. And she would say, it was almost like she would say to me, can you not understand how I feel? She had all the feeling and she just couldn't really contextualise it. And it just, to be quite frank, for me, it just got irritating because she'd say the same things over and over again. And I'd try and reassure her so much and the reassurance didn't work. And I think that got harder and harder for Dad as time went on and Mum became worse, if you like. You know, she would start to say, well, you don't love me. And, you know, we'd say, well, we do, over and over again, and it wouldn't get through. And it was just, a great big snowball of emotions that she just couldn't contain or express adequately, I suppose. So, yeah.
You know, I have so many people in their 50s, 60s and 70s saying, look, you know, they've always known they were on the spectrum. You know, they've had professional careers, they've had children and, you know, been quite successful, you know, some of them. But they've always known that there was something that was, that they couldn't quite put their finger on. And perhaps your mother fell into that category. I certainly did. And I think for people being able to hear and read about your mother's story, I think it would just
be so helpful for so many people of my age.
Yeah, well, I hope so. It's funny, actually. My grandmother always used to say, you know, she lived until she was 92, so I was you know, still able to speak to her, you know, well into my, nearly 40s. And I would say, oh, Grandma, she's driving me around the bend, she's doing this, she's doing this. And she'd say, Anna, she's always been like this. She's different from other people. You've just got to forgive her. So there was sort of an intrinsic, you know, motherly understanding in her daughter as being slightly different, but not being able to put her finger on what it was. So I think that's right. And I'm sure Mum felt like that. I mean, the things she would say about, you know, not understanding other people or not fitting in or the way she would criticise other people was very much in terms of, but they don't do it like I do it, sort of thing. So I really hope my book will make a difference in that way. And also, when Mum was diagnosed, a lot of her friends of that generation just didn't believe it. So, and even at her funeral a couple of years ago, my uncle gave a fantastic eulogy. He was a GP, so I felt it was right for him to stand up and say the things that needed to be said about Mum in that context. And he put it so beautifully. And afterwards, some friends came up and said, you know, she wasn't autistic because she didn't do this and she didn't do that, and you know, and she was a really good friend, and as if, you know, having autism is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then that's it. You know, everybody fits that pattern. So one of the reasons for writing the book was to sort of try and combat that, really, and to say, look, you're a person first, and then you have autism, and not everybody fits a particular mould. But actually, in understanding that Mum had autism, it's helped me to understand her. So I'm hoping that's going to have an effect for other people as well.
I think it is, because, you know, the medical profession certainly doesn't have a handle on this yet. You know, they just don't. And I think the best advocates for us are us, you know, are people on the spectrum that can share their stories.
I think it's brilliant that you've got Tony Attwood, by the way, to review your book or endorsement.
Right about that, because I'd actually never heard of him until Mum's diagnosis, and then I was given a book by Simon Baron-Cohen.
Yes.
And read that, and obviously that was brilliant and made a lot of sense. And then I must have gone through a bibliography or something and found Tony Attwood. Once I realised how much he'd written and how much he knew about women with autism, then I was off and I'm reading loads of his stuff. So yeah, I just contacted him through his website. I didn't expect him to get in touch at all. And he very sweetly got in touch straight away. He said he'd read the book, read it in 2 weeks, wrote me a review, and he's asked me to send him a copy so that he can recommend it to his clients. So
wow.
Amazing.
So you're an author as well of many other books?
Yes. Yeah, so I started off in publishing as an editor, and then in children's books. And so I started writing very short children's books as part of my job, really. And then my boss said, "Oh, I think you can actually do this." So so I went off and wrote some of my own. So yeah, I've written over 50 books for children now. And
wow.
Yeah, so I've written about 2 or 3 a year ever since my own children were born. And but I've never seen myself as just a children's author. I've always seen myself as a writer. So basically anything that's out there that I find interesting, I'll pursue it. And I either write in blogs or, you know, articles for people, or it'll turn into a book. So I don't know what I'm going to write next, but hopefully something for adults to sort of capitalise on having an adult audience now.
And congratulations with your
book coming out on Harper Collins.
Thank you.
And your book, A Place for Everything, and the subtitle is?
My Mother, Autism and Me.
Fantastic. And it will be out on July the 3rd, and it's on Harper Collins, and it's going to be in Waterstones. Hopefully they will be open soon. I know some of the bookshops around the world are beginning to open now. And, of course, Amazon.
Yeah. And all good independent booksellers too, I hope.
You can't forget them. Hopefully there will still be some left after lockdown.
Yeah.
I'm sure there will be. I'm just being very pessimistic, but I'm sure there will be. Yeah. But thank you so much, Anna. I think your book is definitely going to be of great interest to people that watch my videos and read my blog.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you so much for giving me time to talk about it. And it's been lovely to sort of meet you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Anna.